Hajiya Farida's breath was uneven, her chest rising and falling in frantic waves as she pressed Yasmin against the cold wooden door. Their bodies fit together with terrifying precision, as if fate itself had sculpted them for this moment. Outside, the distant call to prayer echoed through the air, a reminder of everything they were defying. But in this room, this private, forbidden space, there was no Alhaji Ibrahim, no world beyond the heat between them. Yasmin's lips were trembling, but not from fear. "You should stop," she whispered. "I can't," Farida answered, voice thick with something neither of them dared to name. Then she kissed her. The taste was familiar, but every time felt like the first. Soft, searching, desperate. Farida's fingers trailed down Yasmin's back, tracing the curve of her waist through the silk of her abaya. Yasmin shivered, her hands instinctively clutching Farida's shoulders. "This is wrong," Yasmin muttered against her mouth. Farida pulled back just enough to look at her, dark eyes searching. "Then why do you keep coming back?" Silence. A heavy, undeniable truth hung between them. They had been here before, many times. In stolen moments behind locked doors, in glances held too long across crowded rooms, in whispered confessions wrapped in guilt and longing. This was never supposed to happen, but it had. Again and again. And it all started years ago. They met in a world where women were meant to walk in the shadows of men. Farida was 20, the daughter of a wealthy and respected businessman, raised with discipline and duty. Yasmin was 19, the rebellious fire that burned too brightly, a girl who spoke too freely and laughed too loudly. Their families knew each other well. Their paths crossed at gatherings, weddings, community events. But it wasn't until they were both sent to the same Islamic finishing school that their worlds truly collided. Farida was reserved, obedient, proper. Yasmin was reckless, bold, untamed. And yet, they were drawn to each other. It started with late-night conversations in the dormitory, whispered under blankets when they should have been sleeping. Then came the small touches, fingers brushing when passing a book, knees pressing together beneath study tables, Yasmin leaning too close when fixing Farida's hijab. At first they told themselves it was friendship. Then one night, when a thunderstorm raged outside their dormitory, Farida kissed her. The power had gone out. The other girls were asleep. The air smelled of rain and old books. Farida had been pacing, anxious, restless. Yasmin sat cross-legged on the bed, watching her with knowing amusement. "Why do you look like you're about to explode?" Yasmin teased. Farida stopped, turning to face her. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She knew what she wanted. She knew what she shouldn't want. "Come here," Yasmin said softly, and Farida did. She knelt on the bed, hands trembling, heart screaming in her chest. Yasmin's breath was warm against her skin, her gaze dark and unreadable. "You're so nervous," Yasmin whispered. "Are you afraid of me?" Farida swallowed hard. "No." "Then why are you shaking?" A beat of silence. Then, without thinking, Farida grabbed Yasmin's face and kissed her. It was soft at first, hesitant. But when Yasmin sighed into her mouth, when her fingers tangled in Farida's hair, all hesitation melted away. It was reckless, dangerous, addictive. They knew the truth now. There was no going back. For months they lived in a world of stolen nights and whispered secrets. Farida would sneak into Yasmin's bed, or Yasmin would pull her into empty classrooms, pinning her against wooden desks, pressing lips to every forbidden inch of skin. They had no future. They knew that. And yet, they couldn't stop. But fate is cruel. Farida's father arranged her marriage before she could even dream of a way out. She was 23 when she became Hajiya Farida, the wife of Alhaji Ibrahim, a powerful man twice her age. On the night of her wedding, She sat in the massive bed, waiting for a man she didn't love. Her body was cold. Her heart was shattered. And somewhere in the crowd of wedding guests, Yasmin watched her with empty eyes. But life moved forward. Farida embraced her new identity, not just as a wife, but as a woman of faith, duty, and status. She and her husband performed Hajj multiple times, strengthening their influence in the Muslim community. With each pilgrimage, she buried another piece of herself, another trace of Yasmin, until Yasmin returned, divorced, alone, and Farida made a reckless decision. She introduced Yasmin to Al-Haji Ibrahim. "She has no one," Farida told him. "I need her around." Al-Haji Ibrahim, seeing no harm in granting his wife a small indulgence, allowed it. And before long, he made Yasmin his second wife. Now they lived under the same roof once again. But this time there was no dormitory to hide in. This time they were being watched. And this time, if they got caught, there would be no escape. The sound of footsteps faded down the hallway. A door closed somewhere in the house. Silence followed. Hajiya Farida stood by the window, fingers trembling as she loosened the knot of her hijab. The fabric slipped from her head, cascading down her shoulders, revealing dark waves of hair she rarely let anyone see. Anyone except Yasmin and her husband. She turned. Yasmin leaned against the door, arms folded, watching her with that same quiet defiance that made Farida weak. Even in the dim candlelight, she was stunning. Long, loose hair framing a face that had once been her entire world. And now, she was here, in her husband's house, in their husband's house. Farida should have never let this happen. But it was too late for regrets. Yasmin took a slow step forward, then another, until the space between them disappeared. "Are you afraid?" she whispered. Farida's pulse stuttered. "Of what?" "Of me. Of this." Yasmin's fingers ghosted over the silk of Farida's sleeve, a barely there touch that sent heat pooling low in her stomach. "Of getting caught." Farida swallowed. Her body betrayed her, leaning into Yasmin's touch like a prayer seeking fulfillment. "We can't," she whispered, even as her breath hitched when Yasmin's fingers slid down to her wrist, tracing the delicate skin there. "But we will," Yasmin murmured, lips hovering near her ear. The air between them was heavy with everything unsaid, with all the nights they had stolen in the past and all the ones they would steal again. Yasmin moved first. A slow, deliberate press of her body against Farida's, the warmth of her skin seeping through layers of silk. Farida exhaled shakily. "This is madness." Yasmin smiled. "Then stop me." Farida didn't. Their lips met, tentative at first, as if testing a boundary they had already crossed 1,000 times before. But the moment Yasmin's hands slid down Farida's back, pressing her closer, all restraint melted. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a claiming, a remembering. The way Farida's hands gripped Yasmin's waist. The way Yasmin sighed against her mouth, parting her lips to let her in. The way their bodies curved into each other, fitting like the spaces between verses of an unspoken prayer. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. Time was moving. But here, in the quiet sanctuary of stolen moments, it stood still. Yasmin pulled back first, just enough to brush her lips over Farida's jaw, over the sensitive skin of her neck, lingering where she knew it would unravel her. Farida's knees buckled. She gripped Yasmin's arms for balance, nails digging into fabric. "You have to go," she whispered, but it was weak, breathless. Yasmin nipped at her earlobe, a teasing punishment for the lie. "Say it like you mean it." Farida's head tilted back, surrendering to the soft press of lips trailing lower. A door creaked somewhere. They both froze. Farida pulled back sharply, heart hammering. "Did you lock the door?" Yasmin's smile was wistful. What do you think? Panic and thrill clashed inside her, creating a high that had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with temptation. She straightened, smoothing her gown, willing the heat in her body to settle. Yasmin watched her with a smirk, arms still lazily crossed. This isn't over, Yasmin said, her voice low, a promise wrapped in warning. Farida's breath was still uneven, her body still thrumming. Go, now! Yasmin held her gaze a moment longer before slipping out, moving down the hall like a whisper. Farida exhaled and touched her swollen lips. She was a married woman, a woman of faith. A woman who had spent years atoning for her past. And yet, as the door closed softly behind Yasmin, all she could think about was when she would see her again. When they would lose control again, and when, if ever, they would be free. Farida moved through the house like a ghost, careful, measured, ensuring no one saw the restless energy humming beneath her skin. She had barely slept, not after last night, not after Yasmin's lips on hers, after the heat of their bodies pressed together in a dangerous moment that left her craving more. More years passed. Hajiya Farida sat at the breakfast table, hands folded neatly, the picture of a dutiful wife. Al-Haji Ibrahim was reading the newspaper, sipping tea, oblivious. Across from her, Yasmin, now Hajiya Yasmin, arrived late, her silk abaya flowing as she sank onto the cushion. Their eyes met, brief, fleeting, but it was enough. A spark. A silent memory of everything that had happened in the dark. Farida looked away first, willing her heartbeat to slow. Then, she felt it. A gaze. Someone was watching her. She turned slightly and met Mariam's eyes. Mariam, Al-Haji Ibrahim's third wife. A younger woman, sharp-eyed and calculating, with a quiet cunning that made her a force to be wary of. Unlike Yasmin, who was all fire and recklessness, Mariam was patient, observant. And right now she was observing Farida and Yasmin with too much interest. Farida forced a serene expression. You're quiet this morning, Mariam. Mariam smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Am I? Yes, Al-Haji Ibrahim agreed absent-mindedly, flipping a page. That's unlike you. Mariam reached for her cup, her gaze flicking between Farida and Yasmin. I was just thinking. Farida's fingers tightened on the rim of her glass. About what? Mariam shrugged, tilting her head. How interesting it is, the way things change when new people enter the household. The words were light, innocent to an untrained ear. But Farida knew better. Yasmin's posture stiffened for a fraction of a second before she recovered, reaching for the tea. Change is inevitable, she said smoothly. Some of us adapt better than others. Mariam's lips curled slightly. Yes, some of us do. Farida forced a smile. Shall I pour you more tea, Mariam? Mariam held her gaze. A challenge. Then she gave a small, knowing smile. Please. Farida's hands were steady as she poured, but inside, her mind raced. Mariam had noticed something, and if she was watching them now, she would not stop watching. This was no longer just about secrecy. This was survival. It started with little things. Mariam was subtle, careful, never too obvious. She would smile a little too knowingly when Farida walked into a room. She would glance between Farida and Yasmin at dinner, letting the silence stretch, waiting for someone to break it. She would make offhand comments to Al-Haji Ibrahim, small, seemingly meaningless things, but each one planting a seed. Yasmin and Farida seemed to be getting along so well. It must be nice to have such deep companionship in this house. You know, women can form bonds stronger than one would expect. Almost like sisters. Almost like more. And Al-Haji Ibrahim, distracted as always, would nod absent-mindedly, never thinking twice. But Farida noticed, and Yasmin noticed. Mariam was watching, and she was enjoying it. One evening, Yasmin found herself alone in the courtyard, the soft breeze cooling her skin. She had come for air, to clear her mind, to shake off the dangerous thrill of everything. But she was not alone. Mariam appeared from the shadows, moving like a cat who had already trapped the mouse. Yasmin tensed but forced a neutral expression. Couldn't sleep? Mariam smiled. Oh, I sleep just fine. But I couldn't help but notice that maybe you don't. Yasmin's stomach clenched. Mariam took slow, deliberate steps forward. It must be difficult, isn't it? Yasmin frowned. What? Loving something you can't have. The words hit like a strike to the chest. Yasmin's fingers curled into fists. I don't know what you're talking about. Mariam chuckled, tilting her head. Of course you do. Silence stretched between them. Then Mariam leaned in, voice dropping to a whisper. Tell me, Yasmin, do you ever forget she's his wife? Or do you just not care? Yasmin's breath hitched. Mariam smiled. Be careful, because if you think I'm the only one who sees it, you're wrong. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Yasmin standing there, pulse hammering in her ears. Yasmin lay on the cool sheets of her bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that she wasn't waiting. But she was. For the quiet footsteps, for the hesitant knock, for the door creaking open just enough for a silhouette to slip inside. She hated it. She hated how predictable Farida was, how weak she was. She had spent years convincing herself she was over this, over her. And yet, here she was, trapped in the very house that had stolen Farida from her, playing a game that had no winners. Because Farida always came back, and Yasmin always let her. A soft knock. Yasmin closed her eyes, exhaling through her nose. Don't answer. Another knock. She turned her head. The door opened slightly, a familiar whisper. Are you awake? Yasmin swallowed the bitterness rising in her throat. What do you think? Farida stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She looked the same as she always did after nights spent with him. Her hijab slightly loosened, her silk robe wrapped tightly around her body, as if trying to shield herself from the weight of her choices. The sight of her made something ugly coil inside Yasmin's chest. She sat up slowly. You shouldn't be here. Farida hesitated. I know. Then why are you? Farida took a slow step forward, then another, until the space between them wasn't space at all. Yasmin clenched her jaw. This was the part she hated, the part where Farida pretended that their past wasn't dead and buried beneath layers of silk and Al-Haji Ibrahim's touch. Pretended that this stolen moment, this quiet defiance, wasn't just another way to ease the guilt pressing against her ribs. Tell me to leave, Farida whispered. Yasmin should have. She wanted to. Instead, she let her fingers slide up Farida's arm, resting against the silk sleeve. Farida inhaled sharply. Yasmin's grip tightened. You are a selfish woman. Farida's gaze darkened. I know. Yasmin hated her for saying that, because it wasn't remorseful. It was a confession, a plea, a surrender, and it was Yasmin who broke first. She pulled her down, capturing her lips with a hunger that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with power, with taking something back, with hurting her the way she had been hurt. Farida gasped against her mouth, fingers digging into Yasmin's waist. But she didn't pull away. She never did. Because the truth was, Farida belonged to Al-Haji Ibrahim by law. But she would always belong to Yasmin in this. After that night, Farida's world became a quiet nightmare. Mariam was everywhere. Always watching, always smiling, never saying enough to accuse, but always saying just enough to unsettle. She would pass by and casually brush her fingers against Farida's shoulder, whispering, "You look troubled, sister." Secrets weighing on your heart? She would make comments at the dinner table like, "It must be hard, sharing things you never meant to share." She would linger too long when Farida and Yasmin were in the same room, forcing them to act so normal it felt unnatural. And Farida was unraveling. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. Every glance from Mariam felt like a silent threat. And then, it got worse. Mariam stopped pretending. It was late when Farida heard the knock on her door. Not Yasmin's. Mariam's. Farida hesitated before opening it. Mariam stood there, her silk robe wrapped tightly around her, dark eyes gleaming like she already knew something Farida didn't. "Sister," Mariam said sweetly, stepping inside without being invited. Farida closed the door behind her, careful not to show the unease creeping up her spine. "What do you want, Mariam?" Mariam wandered around the room like she belonged there. She touched the books on the shelf, ran her fingers along the carved wooden dresser, her expression unreadable. Finally, she turned. "I've been thinking about Yasmin." Farida's stomach tightened. Mariam smiled. "She's different from us, don't you think?" Farida kept her face still. "How so?" "She carries herself like a woman who has never truly had to submit. Like a woman who still believes she has choices." Mariam stepped closer. "And yet she's here. In his house." Farida felt the walls closing in. "What are you getting at?" Mariam tilted her head, studying her, enjoying this. "You tell me," she murmured. "Yasmin doesn't behave like a second wife. She doesn't behave like a wife at all." Farida's fingers curled into fists. "That's not true." Mariam's smirk deepened. "Isn't it?" Farida's heartbeat was too loud in her ears. Mariam leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "A secret is only safe if no one has reason to expose it." Farida's breath hitched. "But you see, sister." Mariam's lips curved, her voice dripping with something dark, dangerous. "Everyone has a price." The next morning, Farida moved through the house like a woman balancing on the edge of a knife. She was careful. Too careful. She spoke too little at breakfast, kept her hands too still when Yasmin was near, and Mariam noticed. She smiled into her tea, not saying a word. She didn't need to, because Farida had already made her first mistake. She had let Mariam see her fear. That night, as Farida was preparing for bed, she found something waiting on her pillow. A note, folded neatly, unmarked. Her hands trembled as she opened it. One sentence. "Sins have a way of coming to light, sister." Farida's breath stopped. She whipped around, scanning the room, her pulse hammering. But she was alone. Or at least, she thought she was. Outside, the hallway was silent. Too silent. She wasn't sure, but for a brief moment, she swore she saw the flicker of someone's shadow disappearing around the corner. One evening, Yasmin had had enough of the hiding, and she and Farida argued. The tension had been building for weeks, thick and suffocating like the air before a storm. The whispers, the stolen glances, the way Mariam's presence loomed over them like a ghost neither of them could shake. But it was Farida's fear that pushed Yasmin over the edge. She had seen it in the way Farida flinched at Mariam's words, how she barely met her gaze across the dinner table, how her fingers trembled when she thought no one was watching. Yasmin was done pretending this was something they could survive by playing it safe. So that night, when Farida tried to avoid her yet again, Yasmin snapped. "You let them take you from me once." Yasmin spat, her voice sharp with resentment. "Now, you're just waiting for them to do it again." Farida froze. She had been walking away like she always did, her hand hovering over the door. But now, she turned back, her expression darkening. "You think this is easy for me?" Farida hissed. "You think I enjoy living like this?" Yasmin stepped closer, her anger burning hotter. I think you like feeling helpless, she shot back. Because it's easier than fighting for something real. Farida scoffed, shaking her head. You don't understand what it means to survive in this world, Yasmin. Yasmin laughed, bitter and sharp. No, Farida. You don't understand what it means to want something so much that you're willing to lose everything for it. A heavy silence settled between them. Farida's jaw tightened. You think love is enough? She whispered. Love doesn't protect us. Yasmin's throat ached. Then what does? Farida swallowed hard, but she didn't answer. Because they both knew the truth. Farida had already chosen her protection. She had chosen security, obedience, a life that kept her safe. And Yasmin had never been part of that life. The fight should have ended there. Yasmin should have walked away. But she didn't. Instead, she reached for Farida's wrist, gripping it tightly. Farida exhaled sharply, her body going rigid. This wasn't like the other nights. This wasn't soft, quiet yearning. This was something raw, something angry, something that tasted like resentment and longing all at once. Yasmin pulled her closer. Farida's breath hitched. You can lie to yourself all you want, Yasmin murmured, her fingers pressing into Farida's skin. But don't lie to me. Farida's eyes flickered with something dangerous, but she didn't pull away. Not when Yasmin closed the space between them. Not when Yasmin's lips brushed against hers, slow and deliberate. Not when Yasmin whispered, "Tell me to stop." Farida's chest rose and fell in frantic waves. She could have said it. She should have said it. But she didn't. Yasmin kissed her with everything she had left, not tenderly, not with patience. This was a battle, a demand. Farida responded in kind. Her hands gripped Yasmin's waist, pulling her closer, deeper, harder. It was fire against fire, the sharp edges of their anger bleeding into something neither of them had control over. The way Farida's nails dug into Yasmin's back. The way Yasmin bit at Farida's lip, punishing her for every night she had left her waiting. The way Farida gasped, breaking first. Just like she always did. Yasmin was the one in control now. And for the first time, Farida let her be. It should have felt like a victory. But as they lay there, breathing heavily, skin damp, lips swollen from the force of what just happened, Yasmin realized something. She had won the fight. But she was still losing Farida. Because Farida was already retreating. Even now, her body curled slightly away. Even now, her fingers trembled as she pulled the sheets over her skin. Even now, her eyes refused to meet Yasmin's. Yasmin's chest tightened. Her voice came out softer than before. Farida. Farida inhaled shakily. We can't do this anymore. Yasmin's stomach dropped. It was the same lie they told themselves every time. But this time, Farida said it differently. This time, Farida sounded like she believed it. And that was the real betrayal. Farida stood, gathering her robe, wrapping herself up like a secret that would never belong to Yasmin. Yasmin stared at the ceiling. She should have felt satisfied, but all she felt was the space between them growing wider. And this time, she wasn't sure if she could close it. Alhaji Ibrahim was not a man given to suspicion. He was a man of order, of routine. A man who trusted what he owned to stay in place. But something was off in his household. He felt it before he understood it. A shift. A tension. A silence that stretched too long between two people who should not be so careful around each other. He noticed it first at dinner. Farida sat beside him, as always. Yasmin across from her. Mariam to his right, quiet but watchful. The evening was normal. Too normal. And then it happened. A simple gesture. A moment so brief that it should have meant nothing. But Alhaji Ibrahim saw it. Yasmin reached for the tea. Her fingers brushed against Farida's wrist. Farida froze. It was barely a second, but Al-Haji Ibrahim saw it. Not the touch, the reaction. The way Farida's breath hitched. The way Yasmin's eyes lingered. The way Mariam smirked, watching it all unfold. A moment. But that was all it took. Al-Haji Ibrahim's fingers tightened around his cup. For the first time, he truly looked at them. And he wondered. Later that night, he sat in his study, a glass of water in hand, a thought he could not shake. Something was there, something hidden. He wasn't sure what it was. Not yet. But he would find out. He always did. That night, Farida lay beside him, her body still and quiet. Al-Haji Ibrahim did not touch her. He simply lay awake, staring at the ceiling. And when he closed his eyes, all he could see was the way she looked at Yasmin. This was not over, not even close. It was reckless. It was stupid. But Farida didn't care. Not tonight. Not when Yasmin's hands were pulling her closer, grasping at silk and skin with the kind of urgency that made the rest of the world disappear. Not when Yasmin's lips were at her throat, breathing fire where only coldness had lived for years. Not when she felt alive in a way she hadn't in so long. They weren't careful. They weren't quiet. And that was their biggest mistake. The door creaked. A whisper of sound. A breath of air shifting in the room. Farida froze. Yasmin still. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up before she even turned. And then she saw him. Al-Haji Ibrahim, standing in the doorway, watching them, not moving, not speaking, just watching. A moment stretched between them. Too long, too silent. Farida's breath caught painfully in her throat. Yasmin's fingers slipped away from her skin. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them breathed, because they already knew. There was no excuse, no way out, no undoing what had just happened. And then, Al-Haji Ibrahim took a step forward. His voice was low, calm, too calm. What is this? Silence. A silence that tasted like the end of the world. If you enjoyed this story and want more, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who would love it, and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And of course, make sure you're subscribed with post notifications turned on so you never miss an upload. Till next time, bye.